In response to e4, if black wants to counterattack white's center with d5, then preparing this central strike with e6, known as the French defense, or c6, the Caro-Kann, are popular ways to achieve this plan. A more confrontational, as well as controversial path is to strike in the center immediately with d5, challenging white's e4 pawn immediately. This turns the game into the Scandinavian defense. White's options are seriously restricted because if white tries to take space with e5, this is well met by c5, taking more control over the center, followed by a natural developing move such as bishop f5, when black enjoys a comfortable game. In response to d5, white should accept black's challenge and capture the d5 pawn. Unlike the French or Caro-Kann defenses, when black is ready to recapture with a pawn, in the Scandinavian a piece must be used to capture this pawn, either with queen takes d5, the most common choice and subject of this video, or else play knight f6, preparing knight takes d5, a sharper variation known as the Portuguese gambit. You may have heard the advice not to develop your queen too early, but the mainline Scandinavian simply ignores this opening guideline with queen takes d5. White has some interesting sidelines to consider. d4 is not a particularly challenging option, as black has the strong reply e5, intensifying the pressure against white's center. Knight f3 is a more serious option to explore, when black can respond actively with bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen, leading to a sharp opening struggle. In exchange for removing white's e4 pawn from the center, white may gain a lead in development by attacking the exposed queen with the mainline option, knight c3. Since black's queen has to move multiple times during the early opening phase, it's tempting to assume this is a dubious opening choice. Although white may work to prove an advantage in certain lines, the Scandinavian should not be underestimated. A strange-looking, but surprisingly sound choice is to simply return the queen back to its original square. This provocative queen move claims that black can simply lose time without any serious consequences. This turns out to be a playable option that should not be underestimated. White is able to take more space in the center with the sensible d4. This emphasizes a key theme in the Scandinavian. White played knight c3, gaining a tempo against the queen, preparing to challenge black's provocative play by controlling the center with d4. As sensible and strong as this choice is, controlling the center with d4 is not a one-sided advantage. The semi-open d-file allows black's queen to add pressure against d4. And the knight on c3 prevents white from reinforcing this central stronghold with c3. This suggests there is more to the Scandinavian than meets the eye, and black is certainly not without resources as well. A typical way for the game to continue is with knight f6, developing flexibly while waiting to see how white may reply. The immediate bishop c4 is one sensible choice when black has the surprising option of a6, with the idea of preparing counterplay on the queen side with b5, as well as striking in the center with c5, provoking interesting play. White's most popular response has been the natural knight f3, helping support the center. If black wants to provoke complications, then preparing a kingside fianchetto with g6 may be considered, as was tried by Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura in a high-profile chess Olympiad game. This proved to be a risky decision, especially as white already enjoys a space as well as time advantage. A more solid path was played by world champion Magnus Carlsen, pinning the knight with bishop g4. Instead of trying to create sharp complications, black's idea is to trade the light-squared bishop, followed by setting up the restraint structures c6 and e6, a resilient structure that is difficult to break down. His opponent, Grandmaster Fabiano Caruana, challenged the bishop with h3 immediately, an idea we'll explore in a moment. But it's worth noting that if white decides to activate the light-squared bishop with bishop c4, pointing directly at black's vulnerable f7 pawn, black needs to be careful. We mentioned that black's plan is to play e6 and c6. Does it matter which pawn is moved first? In this case, playing c6 first would be a serious mistake, as white can play the disruptive shot bishop takes f7 check, attracting the king to f7, when white pounces on black's weaknesses with knight e5 check, forking the king and bishop when white will regain the piece, emerging up a pawn with a tremendous advantage. c6 leads to immediate disaster, so black should restrict white's light-squared bishop by first playing e6. White is able to gain the bishop pair with h3. Retreating the bishop with bishop h5 is a risky decision, as white can play g4, expanding on the king side, followed by queen e2, aligning with the enemy king and preparing queenside castling, building a strong initiative. A more solid approach is to exchange minor pieces with bishop takes f3. Queen takes f3. The d4 pawn is seemingly unprotected for a moment, but queen takes d4 is a serious mistake, as this allows queen takes b7, attacking the unprotected rook on a8. A good way to deal with this queenside pressure is completing the restraint structure with c6. White enjoys the bishop pair, but after trading the light-squared bishop, black immediately creates a light-square structure with pawns on c6 and e6, the same structure as the solid Caro-Kann defense, restricting the light-squared bishop while making it difficult for white's knight to enter black's territory. The structure also restrains the d4 pawn from advancing, as white would love to favorably achieve the d4 to d5 pawn break in order to open up the position, capitalizing on white's lead in development. The d5 square is well supported, and black may decide to plant a knight on that square in the future. Now that queen takes b7 is no longer a threat, queen takes d4 is in the air, gaining a tempo against the bishop. So white sensibly reinforces the center with bishop e3. Bishop e7, followed by kingside castling, is a reasonable option. And black may also decide to remain flexible with knight b to d7. The knight supports the center and may later harass the light-squared bishop with knight b6, and possibly occupy the d5 square. One option for white is to castle kingside, preparing to centralize the rooks, enjoying a central space advantage with more active pieces. Black may respond with bishop e7, followed by kingside castling, or else decide to make the bishop more active with bishop d6, leading to an interesting position well worth exploring. If white would prefer to sharpen the game, then there's the double-edged option of castling queenside. White is ready to expand on the kingside with g4 and h4, building a dangerous initiative on the kingside. Black may decide to respond with knight b6, gaining a tempo against the light-squared bishop, followed by generating counterplay on the queenside with a5. White's space and time advantage, in addition to more active pieces, may offer white the better chances, but black is certainly not without resources in this sharp struggle. The direct bishop c4 is an important line worth examining, but white's main choice has been to confront black's bishop immediately with h3. Once again, bishop h5 is well met by g4, so we see a similar position arise after bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, once again attacking the b7 pawn. Grandmaster Carlsen limited the scope of white's queen with c6. Grandmaster Caruana played the interesting knight e2, supporting the center while opening up a path for the c-pawn to later advance. White also prepared g4, grabbing space and preparing bishop g2. In response to g4, Carlsen played queen d5, offering an exchange of queens and setting the stage for an interesting positional struggle in which the world champion ultimately prevailed with the black pieces. Defending the d4 pawn with bishop e3 is also a sensible choice, but delaying the development of the light-squared bishop also affords white the extra option of playing the active bishop f4. With the light-squared bishop on c4, queen takes d4 would simply win a pawn while attacking this unprotected piece, but without the bishop on c4, black should not be too eager to capture the pawn, as white has the surprising shot knight b5. If black decides to capture the b2 pawn, attacking the rook, this is well met by knight c7 check, followed by rook d1 check, when black's position falls apart. If black accepts the knight with c takes b5, hoping that white will immediately play queen takes b7, which allows an exchange of queens with queen e4 check, with or without first inserting the disruptive queen b4 check. When we analyze the Scandinavian, it's important to remember that black's position is certainly playable, but granting white a significant lead in development is not a decision to take lightly. Instead of playing queen takes b7, white's developmental advantage is on full display with bishop b5 check, preparing to meet knight b to d7 with queen takes b7, attacking the unprotected rook on a8. In this case, forcing an exchange of queens with queen e4 check is not a good idea, because after queen takes e4 and knight takes e4, white has the powerful response bishop c6, forking the rook and knight on e4. And if black tries to move the rook to safety and support the pinned knight with rook d8, white's bishop pair, combined with the active queen, is simply too much to handle after bishop c7. The rook is run out of safe squares, and black's position is in serious trouble. Rather than falling behind in development with the greedy queen takes d4, Black should respect white's lead in development and active piece play, once again relying on the restraint structure with e6. Grandmaster SP Sethuraman, playing white, supported the center while castling queenside. His opponent, international master John Bartholomew, well known for his support of the Scandinavian, demonstrated another way to activate the dark squared bishop with bishop b4. Threatening bishop takes c3, followed by knight d5. Centralizing the knight with knight e4 is certainly possible, but after the exchange knight takes e4, queen takes e4, black has the strong reply queen d5, forcing an exchange of queens as the a2 pawn is unprotected. We see the same idea after knight e2, preparing to maneuver toward the king side while clearing the path for the c-pawn to advance. John took the opportunity to exchange queens with queen d5. A thematic idea in the queen d8 Scandinavian, white's attacking chances are greatly reduced if the queens are exchanged, increasing the solidity of black's play. Since queen takes f3, as well as queen takes a2 is in the air, white has to allow the exchange of queens. Queen b3 was an interesting alternative to exchange queens without allowing black to regain a pawn in the center. But white decided to play queen takes d5, allowing black to play c takes d5, regaining a central pawn presence when white evicted the dark squared bishop with c3, while also supporting the d4 pawn. The bishop on f4 prevents black's bishop from enjoying the active d6 square, so the bishop settled for the solid but less active e7 square. White prepared to complete development with knight g3. Black sensibly activated the other knight with knight c6, when white's light-squared bishop entered the game on the active d3 square. With the closed central structure, an interesting idea was to centralize the king with king d7, activating the king, preparing to participate in the impending endgame struggle. But black decided to castle, reaching a roughly balanced position in which both sides enjoy reasonable chances. In this particular rapid game, I.M. Bartholomew scored an impressive upset against his grandmaster opponent. That being said, white should certainly not fear this position, and now that the light-squared bishop has actively entered the game, white may consider playing knight e2, preparing to expand on the king side with g4. In response, black should prepare a queenside demonstration with a6 and b5, leading to an interesting struggle filled with imbalances. Queen d8 is a reasonable option that should not be underestimated by white. Retreating the queen to d6 is also an interesting line to explore, championed by Grandmaster Sergei Tiviakov. The most common response, however, is for black to play queen a5, aligning with white's knight and king on the e1 to a5 diagonal. The queen will likely come under pressure at some moment, so this variation usually involves c6, helping control the center, as well as providing an escape route for the queen when necessary. White typically continues by grabbing space in the center with d4. As strong of a move as this is, it's worth keeping in mind that the knight on c3 is now pinned, although this shouldn't be a critical factor with proper play. A flexible continuation for black is to play knight f6. When after knight f3, the immediate bishop f5 is possible, but black typically spends a tempo on c6, supporting the b5 and d5 squares, restricting the knight on c3, while also opening up a diagonal for the queen to retreat to either c7 or d8, depending on the circumstances. White's light-squared bishop actively enters the game with bishop c4, adding immediate pressure against the f7 pawn. Bishop f5 is black's most reliable choice, but let's see what happens if black decides to activate the light-squared bishop with bishop g4, pinning the knight on f3 to the queen. We examined this choice when black's queen was on d8, but there are important differences with the queen on a5. With the queen on d8, we cautioned black to respond to bishop c4, not with c6, but recommending to first play e6, as bishop takes f7 check was a dangerous threat. With the queen on a5, however, this is no longer a threat for the time being, as bishop takes f7 check allows king takes f7, preparing to meet knight e5 check, forking the king and bishop with queen e5 check. It's important not to forget the queen on a5 supports the entire fifth rank, so after d takes e5, and bishop takes d1. As the complications settle, black will simply emerge up a piece with a winning game. Just like in the queen d8 variation, white may challenge black's bishop with h3. We reach a similar looking position to the queen d8 variation, so what happens if black plays in the same way with bishop takes f3? Queen takes f3, followed by setting up the restraint structure with e6. In this case, white has the strong reply bishop d2, aligning with the enemy queen, making it uncomfortable on the a5 square. When black exchanges the bishop for the knight followed by setting up the restraint structure, the queen is actually better placed on d8, where it cannot easily be harassed by the dark squared bishop, so in the queen d8 variation, black is only moving the queen twice instead of 3 times in the early opening phase. As we'll see, if black plays the mainline queen a5 variation, the light squared bishop is often best kept on the board for the time being, typically entering the game from the f5 square. In this case, white enjoys the bishop pair in discovering an attack against the queen with knight d5 or even knight e4 remain in the air, when black will fall even further behind in development, so playing in the style of queen d8 and the queen a5 variation is not a good mix of systems. Instead of exchanging the bishop, if black decides to maintain the tension with bishop h5, the immediate g4 is possible, and white may first insert queen e2, aligning with the enemy king while preparing bishop d2 and castling queenside. After black's other knight enters the game with knight b to d7, white may decide to challenge the light squared bishop with g4, preparing to meet bishop g6 with bishop d2, unpinning the knight while aligning with black's queen. Revealing the bishop's attack against the queen with knight d5 is in the air, so black is under serious pressure. The bishop on d2 does block the queen's protection of the c2 pawn. This generally proves to be a poison pawn, as is the case here, because if black decides to play bishop takes c2, black's underdeveloped forces are overwhelmed after the tactical shot knight b5, discovering the bishop's attack against the queen, while eyeing the critical c7 and d6 squares. Queen d8 would allow the unfortunate smothered mate knight d6, taking advantage of the pinned e7 pawn. And if black plays queen b6, white can take advantage of the pinned e7 pawn with knight d6 check, forcing king d8, allowing the deadly fork knight takes f7 check, forking the king and rook. Instead of trying to grab a pawn on c2, black should focus on completing development starting with e6, preparing to meet queenside castling with bishop b4. Activating the dark squared bishop and preparing to exchange it for the knight on c3 if provoked. An interesting line definitely worth exploring. A more forcing choice for white is to play knight d5, discovering the bishop's attack against the queen, when the Scandinavian queen returns home with queen d8. A strong resource for white to take advantage of the lead in development is knight f4, adding pressure against the light squared bishop as well as the sensitive e6 pawn. Black's best response is likely bishop d6, allowing white to gain the bishop pair with knight takes g6, followed by castling queenside. White enjoys the more active position, but black is certainly still in the game. If black tries to avoid this exchange while capturing a pawn with bishop takes c2, this serves as yet another reminder for the Scandinavian player not to fall too far behind in development. This greedy pawn grab is punished by the powerful response knight g5. White has 4 pieces pointing at the e6 pawn, and white's knight is ready to sacrifice itself on f7. Notice in this case the black king could not capture the knight, as this would allow queen takes e6, checkmate. If black decides to try to keep the kingside together with bishop g6, this is too little, too late, as white can play the crushing knight takes g6, preparing to meet h takes g6, with the devastating knight takes f7, forking the queen and rook. Once again, the king cannot capture the knight, as this would allow queen takes e6, checkmate. So this is yet another disaster black needs to avoid. If black tries to protect the weak f7 and e6 pawns with queen e7, white can simply increase the already sizable lead in development with rook c1. Black's wayward light-squared bishop is nearly trapped. Bishop a4 allows b3. When after bishop b5, black's passive position simply falls apart after bishop takes b5, opening up the queenside for white's superior forces. And if black tries to defend the position with bishop g6, white's kingside pawns march forward with h4. White is threatening to trap the bishop with h5, so if black tries to challenge white's knight with h6, knight takes g6, followed by knight takes e6 is a strong option. And white may also refute black's careless play with knight g takes e6, taking advantage of the overworked f7 pawn, which cannot both capture the invading knight and protect the light-squared bishop on g6 at the same time. Black's position is simply collapsing. Instead of playing bishop g4, where it can be confronted by h3, leading to pleasant play for white, the light-squared bishop may prove better placed on the f5 square, which is black's mainline response. Now that the light-squared bishop has been developed, black is prepared to build the restraint structure with e6, preparing to complete kingside development. The immediate knight e5 is an ambitious choice worth exploring, but white's most common continuation is to harass the enemy queen with bishop d2. Black sometimes reacts to this tension with queen c7 when white has the strong reply knight e5, adding pressure against the f7 pawn, while also preparing to grab space and attack the light-squared bishop with g4. A more calm response to bishop d2 is to simply play e6, supporting the center while preparing bishop b4. This is a good moment for white to play just like Grandmaster Fabiano Caruana with knight d5, once again provoking the retreat queen d8. When white forces black to answer a difficult question after knight takes f6 check. Should the queen make a fourth move within the first 9 moves of the game with queen takes f6? Or should black accept a compromise structure with g takes f6? G takes f6 is not an unreasonable choice, and black may prepare queen c7, knight d7, and possibly castle queenside. In response, white may decide to castle short, preparing to place the rook on e1, adding pressure against the e6 pawn, followed by harassing black's light-squared bishop with knight h4, when black needs to play carefully to stay afloat. If black would prefer not to compromise the structure, the queen may make yet another appearance with queen takes f6, when white can play the typically aggressive setup queen e2, preparing queenside castling. A sensible choice for black is to centralize the knight with knight d7, when black faces another critical decision after white castles. Now that white is almost fully developed, trying to open the position with a thematic pawn break d5 is a strong resource to keep in mind. Black may decide to respond with knight b6, attacking the light-squared bishop while supporting d5. And another instructive choice is bishop e7, unpinning the e6 pawn at the expense of depriving the queen a natural escape route, inviting white to play bishop g5, forcing queen g6, when after bishop takes e7, king takes e7. Black has lost the right to castle, so the position is being stretched to its limit. That being said, there's no decisive breakthrough available just yet, so black may prepare to castle by hand with rook h to d8, followed by king f8. As is the case in most of these lines, white enjoys a more active, comfortable game, but black's position remains resilient, so white should not expect to simply destroy black's opening play. The Scandinavian is a confrontational opening that challenges white's ability to control the action from the very first move. Black succeeds in removing white's e4 pawn from the action, but will pay the price of falling behind in development. Moving your queen out too early is generally not recommended, but with careful play, the Scandinavian is a viable option. White should enjoy a lead in development with a central space advantage, so white can often build a more active position with the ability to unleash a dangerous initiative if black is careless. Thanks for exploring the Scandinavian defense, and now you have some interesting ideas to explore the next time black's queen makes its debut on the second move in the game.